Joining me now is Ambassador Mark Regev, Senior Advisor to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's very good to see you again. Thank you for being with us. So
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. There are really two conflicting demands on the Prime Minister right now, and feelings among the Israeli citizens. Israeli citizens, according to all reports, are overwhelmingly in favor of continuing the war, defeating Hamas, the original goals. But the generals are warning that is not compatible, according to a very credible New York Times report. It's not compatible with getting the hostages out, because defeating Hamas means going into the tunnels, and that could be the death sentence for the hostages who are buried there, against all humanity and international law, admittedly. So what can you do? Those families, they were here last week. I met with them. We've interviewed them. They want their children home.
And they're right. And of course, we understand what they're going through. Or we can try to understand the pain, the suffering. As you just reported, their loved ones have been held hostage for 107 days, and it's going on. And they know full well the sort of violence Hamas is capable of. First, we saw that violence, of course, on October 7th, the sort of horrific brutality that Hamas committed, the beheadings, the rapes, the burning of people alive. But also in that first grouping of hostages that were released in November, they talked about systematic psychological and physical abuse. So, of course, one has to feel for the families. But to answer the policy part of your question, we don't think there's a contradiction at a strategic level between pursuing the campaign against Hamas and getting the hostages out. Because in November, when we got over 100 people out, it was precisely the military pressure that got us over the top and got Hamas to agree to release hostages in the framework of a temporary pause in the fighting, because they were desperate for that pause. If we were to unilaterally cease our military operations against Hamas, they'd have no motivation whatsoever to release anyone. So let's keep the pressure on. It worked in November. It can work in January. It can work in February. Let's just keep the pressure on Hamas, make them interested in a ceasefire that involves a pause that brings the hostages home. That's the way it worked in the past. It can work in the future.
Well, there is a growing number of military within Israel that disagree with that conclusion. But let me move on to the so-called day after. I was on the trip, as you know, with Secretary of State Blinken. There was finally a conversation Friday between the president and the prime minister. The prime minister repeated on Twitter and in a very unusual statement on Saturday, that any Palestinian state has to be a non-militarized Palestinian state, that Israel has to provide the security, which is a deal breaker, according to many Palestinians and Arab leaders. So what about this disconnect between the U.S. position, which is aligned with the Arab leaders now, and what Netanyahu is willing to go along with? How do you come up with a Palestinian state that does not have a military security component?
I'm not sure the gap is so large. Ultimately, the Americans are not talking about Palestinian statehood tomorrow. They're talking about something that maybe will happen in the future. And at the same time, Israel says, and the Prime Minister has repeatedly said, we are willing to have a situation where the Palestinians have all the powers to rule themselves and none of the powers that could threaten Israel. Now, that's his formula. And of course, the second part of that formula is particularly understandable, I hope, for international audiences after the terrible October 7th massacre. And it's clear that if there's going to be progress in negotiations with the Palestinians sometime in the future, it'll be based on overall Israeli security control, because when we gave up that security control, we saw what happened on October 7th.
And just quickly, Mark, would Israel agree to a 90-day pause in order to get hostages out? Because that is certainly on the table.
So I can't negotiate publicly with you. There are professionals doing that in closed rooms with the United States with the Egyptians, with the government of Qatar. It worked, as I said before, it worked in November. It could work again now or in the near future. But it has to be understood, Hamas is not going to release anyone because they've decided to be nice people. Hamas are brutal killers. We saw the violence that they're capable of. We saw the brutality, the gruesome brutality that they're capable of. They will only, as President Biden rightly said, they will only respond to pressure, and we are applying that pressure now, and that's the best way, we believe, that we'll get those hostages out.